Picture this. You're a senior executive at the most powerful record label in America. You've been doing this job for 4 years. You've sat across from hundreds of performers. You've developed what you'd call, and what your colleagues would agree, is a pretty reliable eye for talent. You know what good looks like. You know what great looks like. And on this particular afternoon in August of 1967, you're running behind schedule. You have a meeting at 4 o'clock. It's 3:47. The audition in front of you has already run longer than planned. You've seen enough. You stand up. You walk to the edge of the small stage, and you tell the kid at the microphone, a 9-year-old kid in an oversized suit, that you've heard what you need to hear. You tell him he can step down now. He looks at you, and then he turns back to the microphone, and he keeps singing. What happened in the next 2 minutes changed American music forever. Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel is all about the stories behind the stories, the moments that didn't make the headline but made the history. And today we're going deep on one of the most extraordinary moments in music history. A story that most people haven't heard in full, even people who think they know everything about Michael Jackson. This is the story of an August afternoon in Detroit in 1967, a room full of music industry professionals, and a 9-year-old boy who decided quietly, completely, without drama, that he was not done singing. Before we get into it, if you're the kind of person who loves stories like this, do yourself a favor and hit subscribe right now. We do this every week. Real stories, real research, told the way they deserve to be told. Now let's get into it. To understand what happened that afternoon at Motown, you first have to understand what Motown was in 1967. Because it wasn't just a record label, that description doesn't come close. Motown Records in 1967 was something closer to a force of nature. Founded in 1959 by Berry Gordy, a former boxer and auto worker from Detroit, with an $800 loan from his family, Motown had, in less than a decade, completely reorganized what American popular music was allowed to sound like, who was allowed to make it, and who was allowed to love it. Think about what Berry Gordy actually pulled off. He built a label in the segregated American Midwest that put black artists at the center of mainstream pop culture at a time when mainstream pop culture was still, in most parts of the country, rigidly segregated. He did it not by hiding anything or apologizing for anything, but by building something so undeniably excellent that the culture had no choice but to receive it. The Supremes, the Temptations, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, who in 1967 was still a teenager, still in the early chapters of becoming whoever Stevie Wonder was going to become. Martha and the Vandellas, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, these weren't just successful artists. They were the sound of a generation. They were playing on the radio in living rooms from Detroit to London to Tokyo. They were redefining what soul music could be, what pop music could be, what American music could be. Hitsville, USA, that's what they called the Motown headquarters on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit, was the place where all of this was happening. It was where the songs got written, where the artists got developed, where the records got made. It was, in the most literal possible sense, the center of the musical universe in 1967. So when we say that getting an audition at Motown was not a small thing, we mean that in the fullest possible way. This was not a local talent show. This was not a regional showcase. This was the door, the one that, if it opened, changed everything. And that's the door that Joe Jackson had been trying to get to. Now, Joe Jackson. There's a lot to say about Joe Jackson, and most of it is complicated. He was a complicated man who did complicated things in the name of his children's success. History has judged him harshly in many respects, and not without reason. But here is one thing that is simply true. In 1967, Joe Jackson believed in his sons with the specific, consuming conviction of someone who has seen something extraordinary up close and refuses to let the world miss it. He had been managing the Jackson Five, at that point Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, and the youngest, Michael, since they were small children. He had watched them perform at talent shows across Gary, Indiana, building a reputation the way local acts build reputations. One performance at a time, one room at a time, word of mouth spreading the way word of mouth spreads when the thing being described is genuinely remarkable. He had been working the phone, following every connection, every contact, every thread that might lead somewhere larger. He was a man who understood that talent without access is just talent, that the distance between what his sons were and what they could become was the distance between Gary, Indiana, and a room where someone with real power was actually listening. The Motown audition was that room. He had pulled strings, called contacts, pushed at every door that seemed like it might have something on the other side worth getting to. The audition had been arranged through the kind of industry chain that gets built when the people doing the building believe in something enough to make the calls that feel like long shots. And it had landed. They had a date. They had a time. They had a room at Hitsville, USA. They drove from Gary to Detroit. The audition wasn't held in the main Motown building. It was held in a connected rehearsal space, smaller, more functional, the kind of room that exists in any working creative institution as a place where things get evaluated rather than celebrated. 30 people might have fit in there comfortably. There was a small raised stage at one end, folding chairs arranged in rough rows, the kind of room where the lighting is adequate rather than flattering and the acoustics are workable rather than exceptional. This is where decisions got made, not in the grand spaces. In rooms like this, where the people making decisions had made enough of them to know that what they needed was a clear view and decent acoustics, not ceremony. Several Motown staffers were present. 2 junior executives whose names have not survived the various accounts of the day, and 1 senior executive named Walter Hines, who had been with the label for 4 years and who had developed, over those 4 years, the kind of confident pattern recognition that people in his position develop, a reliable internal model of what talent looks like and what it doesn't. He was good at his job. That's worth saying. The fact that what happened that afternoon surprised him doesn't mean he was bad at his job. It means that what happened that afternoon was the kind of thing that surprises people who are good at their jobs because they've calibrated to the normal range of excellence and they've never needed to account for what exists outside it. Berry Gordy was not supposed to be there. This is the detail that keeps appearing in every account of the afternoon, and it matters. Berry Gordy, the founder, the president, the architect of everything Motown had a full schedule that day. The Jackson 5 audition was a routine evaluation, the kind of thing that happened dozens of times a month. Standard procedure was that a preliminary assessment would happen, and if the material warranted it, the findings would be escalated. Berry Gordy would only enter the picture if someone decided he needed to. He had arrived at the building for a different meeting. He stopped into the rehearsal room for what he intended to be 5 minutes. He was still there when it happened. The Jackson 5 had been performing for about 12 minutes when they introduced their youngest member. The first 2 songs had gone well, really well. The brothers were tight, the kind of tight that comes from years of performing together, from developing the specific fluency of people who know exactly where each other are going before they get there. The staffers in the room were watching with the professional attention of people doing assessments, and their assessments were running positive. But it was fine, solid, good even. It was the kind of performance that warranted a serious conversation about next steps. And then Michael stepped to the microphone. He was 9 years old. 9 years old, small for his age, wearing a suit that was, in the way that children's formal clothes almost always are, slightly too large. The sleeves a fraction too long, the shoulders a fraction too wide. He was a child who looked like a child wearing grown-up clothes because that's exactly what he was. He stepped to that microphone with a quality of confidence that people who were in that room have spent decades trying to describe. Not the confidence of a child who's been told he's special and has started to believe it. Not performance confidence, the manufactured kind that you see in kids who have been trained to project. Something else, something quieter and more complete. The confidence of someone who is simply, completely, in the right place. He opened his mouth and he sang. Now, here's where every account of this afternoon runs into the same problem: language. The human voice has this quality, when it's doing something extraordinary, of defying description in a way that almost nothing else does. You can describe a painting in terms of color and composition. You can describe a building in terms of structure and proportion. But when you try to describe what made a voice extraordinary, really extraordinary, not just technically excellent, but the kind that changes the air in a room, the words tend to fail in a very specific way. They get close, and then they don't get there. People who were in that room, or who worked with Michael later, have tried many times to describe what it was that his voice did. The best attempts tend to circle around the same paradox. It had both things that are very hard to have simultaneously: technical precision and emotional directness, control and feeling. Those two things are in tension in most singers. To have control, real control, the kind where you can place a note exactly where you want it and shape a phrase exactly as it needs to be shaped. You usually have to build some distance from the raw emotion that the song is supposed to carry. And to have real emotional directness, the kind that reaches the person listening and doesn't let them remain a passive audience, you usually have to relax some of the technical scaffolding. The greatest singers spend careers finding the balance. Many never fully find it. It's the thing that separates the good from the transcendent. Michael had it at 9 years old. Fully formed, as though it had always been there, waiting only for the body that housed it to grow large enough to let it out. Walter Hinz was paying attention to the clock. It was 3:47. He had a meeting at 4:00. The audition had already run past its allocated time. The preliminary assessment based on the first 12 minutes was solid. Solid enough in Hinz's judgment that escalation to Berry Gordy, who was, he noted with some surprise, still in the room, seemed warranted without needing to see the full performance. He made the calculation that experienced professionals make when they believe they have enough information, and they have somewhere else to be. He stood up. He walked to the edge of the small stage. He said to Michael, not unkindly, in the measured tone of someone managing a schedule rather than dismissing a performer, that they had what they needed. The boy could step down now. What Michael did next is the moment that everyone who was present remembers first. Before the silence that followed, before Berry Gordy's face, before the signing, this is the first thing. Michael looked at him, not with defiance, not with the theatrical challenge of a child who has been told no and wants everyone in the room to know they've been told no. Not with fear, not with confusion, not with the particular shrinking that children often do when an adult with authority gives them a clear instruction in a room full of other adults. He looked at him the way you look at someone when you've heard what they said, and you're genuinely considering whether it constitutes a reason to change what you're doing. He considered it. Then he turned back to the microphone. And he kept singing. Put yourself in that room for a moment. You've just watched a senior executive walk up to the edge of the stage, give a clear and polite instruction to a 9-year-old, and have that instruction acknowledged, and then, quietly, completely, without drama, set aside. In a room full of industry professionals, in front of the founder and president of the label, in an audition that determines whether the Jackson family makes the drive back to Gary with something or with nothing. The air in a room changes in a moment like that. Everyone present feels it. The brothers on stage behind Michael felt it. Tito, Jermaine, Jackie, Marlon, they've talked about this moment separately across different interviews and different decades, and they all describe the same thing. A shift in the room's atmosphere when Michael turned back to the microphone. A held breath. A collective understanding that something unexpected was happening. Joe Jackson, at the back of the room, went very still. Walter Hinz stood at the edge of the stage in the specific discomfort of a man whose instruction has been received, acknowledged, and not followed, in front of an audience that has registered all of this. And Michael sang. He sang the remaining verse. He sang the bridge. He sang the final chorus with everything he'd been doing for the previous 12 minutes behind it, the full weight of whatever that voice was, doing what it was built to do. When the last note ended, the room went silent. Not the polite silence that precedes applause, not the silence of people composing their professional responses. The kind of silence that only happens when a room full of people has just collectively experienced something that none of them have a ready category for, and they need a moment, not a polite moment, a real moment, before anything else can happen. There's a version of this story that jumps straight from the singing to the signing. Michael sang, Berry Gordy was impressed, contract done. That's the short version, and it's not wrong exactly, but it misses what's most interesting. What's most interesting is the silence, and what the people in that room did with it, and what it revealed. Let's go through the witnesses. Berry Gordy had been in the music business for the better part of 2 decades by this point. He had heard a lot of voices. He had sat in a lot of rooms where someone performed and the room responded. He had developed his own reliable internal model of what talent looked like, a model that had produced Diana Ross, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder. He said later, in interviews, in his memoir, that he had never heard a room go quiet in the particular way that room went quiet when Michael finished singing. He was careful about how he described this. He was a precise man, Gordy, when it came to talking about music, And he was clear that the quality of the silence was specific. It wasn't the silence of an unmoved audience. It wasn't the silence of people with nothing to say. It was, and this is his description, the silence of people who have been moved past the point where saying something feels adequate. He said it was the silence of people holding something that they hadn't yet figured out how to put down. By the time the last note ended, Berry Gordy was standing. Nobody could say exactly when he'd gotten up. He had arrived in his seat with the settled posture of someone who expects to leave in 5 minutes and doesn't need to be comfortable. And at some point during the final chorus, he had risen, and he was standing. And he was looking at the small boy at the microphone with the expression of someone who has just encountered something that has reorganized his understanding of what he is looking for. He signed the Jackson 5 to Motown Records. The process took months, contracts, negotiations, the full administrative architecture of a major label deal. But the decision was made that afternoon, in that silence. Walter Hines had returned to his seat at some point during the final verse. Nobody who was in that room could say exactly when. One moment he was standing at the edge of the stage. The next time anyone specifically registered his location, he was seated. The moment of his return went unnoticed because the room's full attention was on Michael, and when attention in a room collects the way it collected in that rehearsal space during that final chorus, peripheral details stop registering. He attended the Jackson 5's first major Motown recording session in early 1968. He said nothing about the audition. There was nothing to say. The instruction, the non-compliance, the outcome, all of it was obvious to everyone who'd been present and to the people who learned the story later. The room had given its verdict in a way that made commentary unnecessary. Jackie Jackson was 17 at the audition. The oldest of the brothers, old enough to have developed a perspective on the group's dynamic that the younger ones didn't yet have. He had been performing since he was a young child. He had watched the center of gravity in the Jackson 5 shift, incrementally, as Michael grew into something that none of them had fully predicted. He said later that he had known, from the moment Michael stepped to the Motown microphone, that whatever happened in that room was going to be about Michael in a way that previous rooms hadn't been. Not because Michael was doing anything different from what he'd been doing in Gary, but because the room was different. The room had the specific gravity of consequence. And in rooms with that kind of gravity, what Michael was became visible in a way that ordinary rooms didn't reveal. But here's the part of Jackie's account that I find most interesting. He said his first instinct, when Walter Hines walked up to the stage and told Michael to step down, was the instinct of an older brother, the protective impulse, the readiness to intervene on behalf of a 9-year-old being told to stop by an adult with institutional authority in a room full of other adults. He said he did not intervene. He said he stopped himself because something in Michael's response made it clear that intervention was not what the situation required. Michael hadn't looked afraid. He hadn't looked uncertain. He had looked, briefly, like someone receiving information and assessing it. And then he had turned back to the microphone with the complete settled attention of someone who has assessed the information and found it insufficient reason to stop. Jackie said that in all the years that followed, all the performances, all the recordings, all the extraordinary things he watched his brother do in rooms around the world, he came back most often to that moment, not to the singing, to the turning back. The quiet, complete, undramatic decision is how he described it. To keep doing what he was doing because the song was not finished, and therefore he was not finished. He said he'd never seen that quality in anyone else. Not the talent, the clarity, the absolute certainty at 9 years old about what the song required and what that requirement superseded. Tito Jackson was 19, standing at the far end of the stage. He said he'd been watching Berry Gordy during the final verse, not Michael. He'd made a calculation in the moment. Michael's fate in that room was going to be determined by Berry Gordy's face, and therefore Berry Gordy's face contained more useful information than watching Michael, whose capabilities Tito had already had 11 years to observe. What he saw on Gordy's face during the final chorus was not, he said, the expression of a man making a business decision. It was the expression of a man who had forgotten, briefly, that he was in a position to make a business decision at all. He was a listener, not an assessor. The professional machinery had, for a moment, been bypassed entirely. Tito said, Berry Gordy came to assess a child. The child assessed him right back, and the child won. Marlon Jackson was 11. He said he remembered the silence most. He said it was the longest silence he had ever experienced in a performance context. And he said it had a quality he could not fully explain to people who hadn't been in the room. A weight that was not uncomfortable, but that could not be ignored. That required everyone present to simply sit in it for however long it required before the room could begin to move again. He said he had experienced many silences in many rooms in the years that followed. He'd learned to read them. The difference between the silence of an unmoved audience and the silence of a moved one, between polite applause silence and the other kind. He said the Motown rehearsal room in August of 1967 was the template against which he measured every silence that came after. He said nothing had matched it. He said he didn't expect anything ever would. Here's the thing I want you to sit with for a moment. This story is usually told as a talent story. Michael Jackson had an extraordinary voice. He demonstrated it at the Motown audition. Berry Gordy recognized it and signed him. That's the talent story. That's the version that gets told in music history books and documentary segments. But that's not actually what's most interesting about that afternoon. What's most interesting is the turning back. The moment after Walter Hines gave his instruction, when Michael, a 9-year-old child, in a room full of industry professionals, at an audition that represented the single most consequential opportunity his family had ever been given, processed the information, found it insufficient, and returned to what he was doing. Because here's what that moment required. It required a 9-year-old boy to have a clearer sense of what the song demanded than an adult with institutional authority had of what the schedule demanded. It required him to have prioritized that internal sense of completion. The song is not done, therefore I am not done, above the social pressure of compliance in a high-stakes room. It required him to understand, at some level that may not have been conscious or articulate, but was clearly operative, that the thing he was doing was the only thing in that room that actually mattered, and that stopping it before it was finished would be a kind of failure that had nothing to do with whether the executives had heard enough. That's not a 9-year-old refusing to follow instructions. That's a 9-year-old who has, somehow at 9 years old, developed an internal relationship with music that is more fundamental than his relationship with the social architecture surrounding it. That's not talent, that's something else. Talent is the voice, the control, the emotional directness, the technical precision that shouldn't exist in a child's instrument and existed fully formed in Michael's. But the turning back, that's character. That's the thing you can't teach and can't develop in a rehearsal room, the thing that either exists in someone or it doesn't. Jackie Jackson, who watched it happen and has had almost 60 years to think about what it meant, put it simply. He said, that was the thing he had never seen in anyone else, not the talent which was visible to everyone, but the clarity. Now, some of you are probably thinking about a version of this story where the room goes differently, where Michael turns back to the microphone and it doesn't work out, where the stubbornness, and let's call it what it also was, because it was also that, where the stubbornness lands wrong, where Walter Hines is irritated rather than overridden by what he's witnessing, where the audition ends in an uncomfortable shuffle toward the exit. It's worth sitting with that version, because it illustrates something true about the nature of moments like this. The turning back was either going to be remembered as an extraordinary act of conviction or an embarrassing act of insubordination. The only thing that determined which was what came out of the microphone after Michael turned back to it. The voice is what made the turning back legendary instead of just awkward. But the turning back is what gave the voice the chance to do what it needed to do. They're not separable, that's the point. The talent and the clarity were both necessary. One without the other and the afternoon doesn't become a story worth telling. One without the other and the Jackson 5 make the drive back to Gary with a polite rejection and a vague sense of what might have been. Both together in a 9-year-old who weighed less than the suit he was wearing, and the afternoon becomes the beginning of something. The signing took months to finalize. It always does. Major label deals involve contracts, negotiations, lawyers, royalty structures, the full bureaucratic apparatus of an industry that has, by necessity, developed elaborate processes for turning artistic relationships into legal ones. But the deal was real from the afternoon of the audition. Berry Gordy had made his decision in that room, in that silence. Everything that followed was administration. The Jackson 5 moved to Los Angeles. They worked. They developed. They spent time at Motown being refined in the Gordy manner. Motown had a specific approach to artist development that was almost like a finishing school, a combination of vocal coaching and stage presence and media training that turned talented performers into polished ones. The infrastructure behind the sound was elaborate and intentional. And in 1969, they released I Want You Back. If you have ever heard that song, and there is almost no chance you haven't, because it has been playing on something somewhere in the world every day for more than 50 years, you know what happened next. The Jackson 5 became almost immediately the biggest act on the planet. Not the most critically acclaimed, not the most respected by the industry cognoscenti, the biggest. In the way that something is biggest when it reaches people who don't care about those distinctions, and just know that the thing coming out of their speakers is making them feel something they want to keep feeling. Michael was 11 years old. What followed over the next 5 decades is in some ways the longest footnote to an August afternoon in Detroit, the solo career that reshaped popular music the way the Beatles had reshaped it a generation earlier. Off the Wall, Thriller, Bad, Dangerous, a series of albums that didn't just succeed commercially but changed what the form could do, what production could be, what a music video could be, what a live performance could aspire to. The moonwalk, the glove. The sounds that became the shared shorthand of a generation. All of it rooted in something that was present and fully formed in a 9-year-old who stood at a Motown microphone in 1967 and decided, in the quiet, complete way of someone who has no other option, that the song was not finished. Michael Jackson never spoke publicly about that specific moment. He gave many interviews across his career. He spoke often and with genuine feeling about the early Motown years, what it meant to be a child in that environment, what Berry Gordy had taught him about the architecture of popular music, how the experience of being formed by Motown had shaped his understanding of what a record could do, and how an artist should develop their relationship to their craft. But he didn't single out the afternoon in the rehearsal room, the instruction to step down, the decision to keep singing. Maybe it wasn't the way he thought about those years. Maybe the moment that loomed largest for everyone who witnessed it was, from inside it, simply a moment of doing what the song required. Maybe the psychological state that made the turning back possible was the same psychological state that made it unremarkable from the inside. A relationship with music so fundamental and so complete that the idea of stopping before it was finished didn't register as defiance, just as an impossibility. Some people are built that way, not many but some. The rehearsal space on West Grand Boulevard was repurposed as storage sometime in the late 1970s. The small stage was removed. The folding chairs went to other uses. The specific physical geography of that afternoon was dispersed in the ordinary way that institutional spaces get repurposed when the things that happened in them have moved on to happening elsewhere. The room that hosted one of the most consequential auditions in music history became a place to keep boxes. But here's the thing about moments that happen in rooms. The room is the least important part. The room is just where it happened to be. The thing that actually matters lives in the people who were there, in the way they carry it, in the standard it sets for everything that comes after. Every person who was present in that rehearsal room on that August afternoon carried the afternoon with them in the particular way that witnesses carry things that showed them something true. Not as a story to tell at dinner parties, exactly, though it became that too. As a reference point, a standard against which other things got measured. The silence of moved people in that room became the template against which Marlon measured every subsequent silence in every subsequent room. The turning back became the thing Jackie held in mind when he tried to explain to people what made his brother different. Not the talent, which was obvious, but the clarity beneath the talent, the thing that determined what the talent would actually do in the world. Berry Gordy, who in the years after Michael's death gave many interviews that returned, again and again, to the early relationship between Gordy and the youngest Jackson, consistently described that afternoon as the moment he understood he was dealing with something outside his existing categories. He had spent years developing categories. The Motown system was, in many respects, a sophisticated set of categories, ways of understanding what talent looked like and how to develop it, and what it could become. Michael fit the categories in some ways and exceeded them entirely in others. And the moment that made the exceeding visible was the moment he turned back to the microphone. Here's what I keep coming back to. Walter Hines was not wrong. He had heard enough. He had seen enough. His assessment of the Jackson 5 was correct. They were genuinely talented. They warranted serious attention. Escalation to Berry Gordy was the appropriate next step. He was doing his job accurately and efficiently, and there was nothing in his professional experience that would have told him the 9-year-old was doing something that required a different response than the one he gave. He wasn't the obstacle to Michael's greatness. He was just the person who, by standing up at 3:47, gave Michael the choice. And Michael chose. In the way that people who are fundamentally, constitutionally built around something always choose when the choice gets made in relation to that thing. Not with drama, not with calculation, with the simple, complete, unself-conscious certainty of someone who does not actually experience it as a choice at all, because the alternative, stopping before the song is done, is not something the internal architecture can accommodate. That's who Michael Jackson was, at 9 years old in an oversized suit in a small rehearsal room in Detroit. That's what that afternoon revealed. The audition didn't create it. Motown didn't create it. Berry Gordy didn't create it. The 10,000 hours of rehearsals in the Jackson family living room didn't create it, though they shaped it and honed it and gave it more and more to work with. It was already there, already complete, already more fundamental than anything that could be layered over it. The Motown audition just gave a room full of people their first clear view of it. That was all, that was everything. There's a version of Michael Jackson's story that's about the fame and the tragedy and the complexity and the questions that don't have clean answers. That version is real, and it matters, and it deserves to be engaged with honestly. But underneath that story, prior to all of it, foundational to all of it, is this. A kid from Gary, Indiana, who was built around music in a way that no external circumstance could override. Who had, at 9 years old, a relationship with what he was doing that was more fundamental than his relationship with anything else in a room. Who, when given the instruction to stop, looked at the person giving it, really looked, really considered, and found the instruction insufficient. And turned back. And kept singing. Everything that followed, the records, the performances, the cultural presence that has not diminished in the decades since his death. The songs that are still playing on something somewhere in the world every single day, everything followed from that. From a clarity that existed before anyone had given it a stage large enough to be visible. That's the story. That's who he was. If this video did something for you today, if it gave you something to think about, or showed you something about someone you thought you already knew, share it with someone. That's the best thing you can do for this channel. No algorithms, no gimmicks, just share it if it was worth sharing. And if you want more stories like this, real stories, told the way they deserve to be told, subscribe. We're here every week. I'll see you in the next one.